Continuing now with part 2 of the Pilgrim's story. They had made it to Holland, fleeing England because of the fact that separating from the Church of England, they were guilty of treason, punishable by jail, or if you were a pastor leading such a group, punishable by death. And in Leyden, they had the freedom to worship, which was the most important thing for them. And the church grew in a small town called Leyden. And they worked there for 12 years, and the work was long hours, a little pay, and the Dutch influence on their children was drawing them away from the Lord, and they just prayed and asked God to show them if there wasn't another place that he would have them go to where they could share the gospel with others and have their own colony built on the Word of God. And the more they prayed, the more they felt that the coast of America was where they were establishing new colonies would be where God would be leading them. So they sent some of their chief men to two men actually to go to England and apply for a charter, which they eventually did get. And they found an adventurer who said he would finance the trip, and he would give them a fair contract, which turned out not to be true. But they set out in September, or actually in August of 2020, to take a ship called the Speedwell from Amsterdam to the English seaport of Southampton, where they would join the merchant ship, the Mayflower. And as they left, they prayed. There were less than half of the numbers in the church that were making this voyage. When they got to Southampton, they found out that Thomas Weston, the adventurer who was helping them finance the trip, had arranged for another group to travel with them. And this other group was known as strangers who were going to the New World, not because of religious convictions, but mostly because of their promise that they could potentially earn a lot of money in the New World. And so almost half of the group were the strangers. And right from the very beginning, we see a conflict that developed even before the voyage. The Speedwell was also purchased to make the voyage, but in 3 attempts to leave England and out sea for just 2 or 3 days, the Speedwell took on water. And eventually, from the seaport of Plymouth, England, they made the decision to sell the Speedwell and for everybody to come on board the Mayflower. And the numbers that ended up coming on board were 102 of the separatists and the strangers that became known as the Pilgrims. Now, you had 102 people with all their supplies and belongings inside a space not much bigger than the size of a volleyball court, below decks. And when they set out to sea, it was not many days before the seas became very rough. These were farmers who were not used to the sea. The sailors tended to be very rugged men and loved to make fun of these puny pilgrims and farmers. In fact, one young sailor, a very strong, muscular sailor, would come down and would laugh at them and say, "Any day we're going to be throwing your shrouded bodies overboard into the sea as you die of sickness." And in a strange sense of fate, he was the first one to become sick, and within a day died, and was the first shrouded body to be thrown overboard. And as this ship progressed, the conditions were horrific. They had to stay below deck most of the time because of the storms. So here you are with 102 people and constantly passing buckets that captured what came out on both ends. And you had babies that were crying, and you had a horrific odor. And finally, one young man named John Holland, several days out at sea, said, I can't take this anymore. I've got to have some fresh air. And against the captain's orders, went above deck. As soon as he lowered the hatch and was on deck, the waves picked him up, and overboard he went. By God's grace, his arm snagged a spar like a rope that he hung on to, and the soldiers pulled him on back the ship, the Mayflower, and he went down below deck and never disobeyed the captain's order after that. And then the biggest crisis occurred about halfway across the ocean when a loud boom was heard. And right away the Pilgrims could see what the problem was, and that was the beam holding the main mast had cracked, and the mast was sagging dangerously. And unless that were repaired, they would all perish. The Pilgrims right away did what they knew to do best. They started praying. And as they were praying, Bradford got an image in his mind of a large screw that was somewhere in their supplies, and to this day we don't know if it was a screw that was used to build and put beams together, or it was for a printing press. But either way, they eventually found it, and it was effective in bringing the mast and the beam back in place to make the rest of their voyage secure and safe. And there was only one fatality on the trip. One of the Pilgrims, a man named William Button, who refused to drink Dr. Fuller's lemon juice, and most likely died of scurvy. But on November the 9th, they spotted land. And the unfortunate thing was they had planned to leave on this voyage 3 months earlier, but because of one delay after another, instead of arriving at the beginning of summer, they're arriving at the beginning of winter. The worst time to be arriving in the New World. And once they spotted land, they realized that some of the strangers were talking about mutiny. And so right away, the Pilgrim chief men, which is William Brewster, William Bradford, John Carver, Edward Winslow, joined together, prayed, and God gave them what is known today as the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact established just and equal laws for everybody. And they presented this to those on board, and the majority of men and women signed the Mayflower Compact, which gave them a system of government and control for anybody that might be thinking of mutiny or breaking any laws that would be detrimental for the group as a whole. And then the important thing was where to settle. And they had thought about settling in the northern portion of the Virginia colony, but it seemed like just with the weather and circumstances that the Cape Cod area was where they started to look for a place to build their colony. And they had 3 expeditions from the ship where they went ashore and sought out a place to establish their colony. And unfortunately, because of the weather, some of these outings were the origin of death for some of the Pilgrims, coming down with sicknesses and having to wade through water. And on the On the second expedition, when they were out and had established a camp and put up some barricades overnight, they were constantly trying to signal Indians that they wanted to be their friend, who they would see off in the distance, but the Indians would just take off. And on this one particular night, at about midnight, as they're starting to settle in, and again, this is a group from the Mayflower that composed of some of the pilgrims and some of the sailors as well. They hear howls and yells, and one sailor says, well, he thinks it's just coyotes. And another is not so sure, but in the morning, as they're up early and starting to carry their muskets and supplies to the boat, called the Scallop, which was a large boat that they had assembled, all of a sudden they hear howls and they're under Indian attack. And for several minutes, there's muskets that are being fired at the Indians, there's arrows that are flying into the barricade, and when it's all over, no fatalities on either side, no injuries, and one might ask, was that God's providence, or were they just bad shots? Well, probably a combination of both, but the Pilgrims did not want to harm the Indians. They wanted to be friends with the Indians and to share the good news of God's love with them. And then the third expedition was a day of discovery, and it was a time when they came across a piece of land that was in back of a large rock just off the coast. And the land had been obviously settled before, had been cleared for planting. There were 3 fresh brooks that were on this land. It was landscaped in a way that they could have security and protection with a hill. And so they very excitedly returned to the ship to share the good news. And again, we're talking about now the first week in December when they discovered this place. And the sad thing was that when they returned to the ship, they were met with bad news that William Bradford's wife had fallen overboard and drowned. And this was obviously devastating for young Bradford. But then as they started to make arrangements, it was actually Christmas Day when they first started building their first dwelling. And by that time, the bodies of many had been weakened, had been affected by the cold and the wet. And in December, there were 6 who passed away. And as they went into the winter months, every day they were concerned that the Indians might attack. They had not made any friendly contact with the Indians. And then in January, William Bradford became so ill they didn't expect him to live, but thank God he did recover. There were 8 deaths in January. And then in February, there were 17 deaths. And then in March, another 13. And by the time spring came, almost half of their number had perished. And around the 20th of March, something very unusual happened. And that was that as they are meeting in their common house at the top of the hill, having a military discussion, and they had appointed Miles Standish as their military leader. Now, he was the only pilgrim that had had military experience. And he was very short, with reddish hair, and he would get very angry anytime somebody would call him Captain Shrimpy. And his face would become flushed and match the color of his hair, but he knew military, and he knew military procedures, and So as they're meeting in the common house, discussing some military procedures with only a few men, actually, that are still able to defend the colony if they need to, all of a sudden somebody yells out, "Indian coming." Well, they look out the door, and sure enough, there's a tall, stately Indian just marching up the street, dressed only in a loincloth. And when he reaches Miles Standish, the first thing he says is, "Got any beer?" And he was an Indian that was part of the Algonquins, came from Maine, and his name was Samoset, and he would travel up and down the coast, and he would barter with sea captains and translate for them as well. And then he told them about the land they were on, that it was part of the tribe that used to be the Patuxets, that because of a disease they had all passed away, and he would come back and bring Chief Massasoit, who was head of the Wampanoags and over several tribes in the immediate area. And when he came back a few days later with Chief Massasoit, he also brought with him Squanto. Squanto was a young man that is one of the heroes of this story. And in my third part, I will tell you more about Squanto and how God used him, most likely to save the lives of the Pilgrims.